The gold standard provides another example of economics making popular literature. In The Importance of Being Earnest by Oscar Wilde, first performed in 1899, the tutor, Miss Prism, tells her student Cecily that she should omit metallic problems from her study of political economy, feeling that the topic might be too melodramatic. This is a fair reflection of the controversy that's often attached to the gold standard. In the last decades of the 19th century, Geoffrey Frieden has described the gold standard as the most powerful organising principle of global capitalism. And even in the 20th century, after the gold standard had formally ceased to exist, arrangements for tying the currencies of different countries together have still been an important part of the international economic environment, through to the present, where the most notable example is the Eurozone. Yet the gold standard has never been entirely accepted. For example, in the 1890s, the Populist Party in the United States, a party that attracted a large amount of support, had as the first plank in its program to move the United States off the gold standard. If we fast forward to the present, you'll be aware of the large amount of debate that exists about the Eurozone and the single currency within the Eurozone, and the extent to which that is a source of economic problems of some countries in the Eurozone. So it seems worthwhile spending a little time understanding what the gold standard is and getting a historical perspective on how it came to be adopted. The gold standard is an arrangement whereby a country agreed that anyone holding its currency could redeem it for a fixed amount of gold. Sometimes the currency itself would be in gold under the gold standard, so that there would be that automatic capacity to redeem. A critical corollary of countries being on this gold standard arrangement was that any two countries on the gold standard arrangement were effectively pegging their currencies at a fixed rate against each other. For example, suppose in Australia £1 equals 1 ounce of gold, so you know that if you have £1 in Australia you can redeem 1 ounce of gold for it. And in the UK, £1 is equal to 2 ounces of gold. So you know that if you're in the UK, you can redeem 2 ounces of gold for any pound that you own. Then what that means is that 1 UK pound is equal to 2 Australian pounds. That's because someone in the UK could have taken £1. With that pound, they could have redeemed 2 ounces of gold. They can then go to Australia, and with 2 ounces of gold, they can buy £2 because of the rate at which pounds and gold are transferred in Australia. So by each country linking its currency to this same medium of gold, you effectively fixed the exchange rate between those two countries. You fixed the rate at which the currency of one country could be exchanged for the currency of another country. Now, Britain had adopted the gold standard in 1717, but for a long time it was the only country on the gold standard. Other countries had silver as the currency that they used as the metal that they used to support their currency, or they had a bimetallic system where both stocks of gold and silver could be used to support currency in their country. But beginning in the 1870s, as this graph shows, an increasing number of countries started to move onto the gold standard. So from around about 5 countries from the sample I've used in drawing this graph in 1870, there was a rapid increase up to 20 countries by the end of the 1870s, and then also in the early 20th century, another big increase in the number of countries on the gold standard. The reason there was initially this increase in the number of countries on the gold standard was the increasing prominence of the British economy, the increasing importance of the British economy in world trade, and the growing volume of world trade. So other countries who were trading with Britain found it advantageous as a way of reducing the costs of trading to know what the rate of exchange would be when they needed to buy from or sell goods to Britain. And if they moved on to the gold standard, they could do that because, as just described, being on the gold standard with Britain meant that they effectively had their exchange rate fixed against Britain. Whereas if, for example, they remained on a silver standard, then their exchange rate with Britain could fluctuate as the relative prices of gold and silver changed. So being on the gold standard meant that other countries fixed their exchange rates against Britain. That was increasingly valuable because of the increasing trade countries were doing with Britain, and so we see increasing number of countries moving on. And of course, the more countries moved on, the more other countries then had an incentive to move on, because even if they weren't trading with Britain a lot, if other countries they did trade with had moved on to the gold standard, then they had incentive to move on to have a fixed exchange rate against those countries who they did trade with. What did being on the gold standard mean? Well, the big thing that it meant was that the gold standard induced an automatic process of adjustment to external imbalances that might affect a country. So, for example, suppose a country developed a balance of payments deficit due to imports being above exports. What would happen? Well, imports being above exports means that you owe more to foreign suppliers than you are owed by foreign suppliers. So in other words, you have a net debt to the rest of the world. Now, what the gold standard meant was that that net debt, which you had to sort of pay to the rest of the world, in theory, could be redeemed in gold. So you're having to sort of give out more of your currency to international suppliers of imports than you're getting back from buying your exports. So you're sending currency offshore. And what that means is that currency potentially could have been redeemed in gold. Sometimes if the currency actually was gold, then you were really sending the gold, itself to international suppliers. That meant that within your country, where you've got this balance of payments deficit, there's now a reduced stock of gold because you've had to pay this international debt. That reduced stock of gold means that the government in the country, because the gold standard determines the amount of currency, they have to reduce the amount of currency. So that means that there's going to be deflation. Prices are going to fall. If prices fall, that makes your export products relatively cheaper now, and it makes imports seem relatively more expensive. So what should happen is there should be a growth in the amount of exports you sell and a decrease in the amount of imports that you're buying from overseas, because imports have become more expensive, but your exports have become cheaper. That will reverse what was the balance of payments deficit, because you were importing more than you were exporting, but now what's happened is your exports were below your imports, but now your exports have increased, your imports have come down, so you brought back into balance of payments equilibrium. So being on the gold standard meant that there was an automatic adjustment mechanism by which a country's external situation would be brought back into balance. Now, this adjustment process could be facilitated by policymakers. So, for example, if a country develops a balance of payments deficit, then the central bank could raise interest rates. By raising interest rates, that would attract capital flow into the country, which would be another way of restoring the external imbalance. And if capital markets anticipate that policymakers are going to respond to this external imbalance by increasing interest rates, they may in fact have speculative flows of capital into the country even before policymakers react. So, central feature of the gold standard was the idea that it induced for countries that abided by the gold standard an automatic adjustment mechanism to external imbalances. It meant that a country should not permanently, for example, keep running an external deficit, because there was this adjustment mechanism that would automatically reverse that situation. A corollary of this feature of the gold standard was that it meant that independent macroeconomic policy was not something that countries who were on the gold standard could engage in. This is because if, for example, a country tried to expand economic activity by increasing its money supply, what that would do is it would increase prices, and that would have the reverse effect of what I just described before. Increasing prices would make exports more expensive, it would make imports relatively cheaper. That would create a balance of payments deficit, and with a balance of payments deficit, that would bring into play the adjustment mechanism which I talked about just previously, which is that prices would then decrease because of the outflow of gold. There would be a increase in exports, decrease in imports to reverse the balance of payments deficit. And you'd be back to the position where you were in before. Basically, your attempt to expand the economy through inflation would have been reversed through an episode of deflation via the balance of payments adjustment mechanism. So the gold standard was really this method that if countries adhered to it was kept them responsible policy makers, responsible economic managers of the domestic and international economic situation they were in. And so this was understood by capital markets, and it was understood that countries that were on the gold standard during this period tended to have more stable money supply, tended to have lower rates of inflation, tended to have lower government budget deficits. And so international investors were more willing or demanded a lower price to be willing to lend to countries that were seen as adhering to the gold standard, because that was seen as imposing this discipline on them to behave well. If you found a country that was on the gold standard, it was a country you could be pretty confident was going to pay its money back. And here's an example of this showing the predicted interest rate on gold bonds for different countries. So it sort of takes the console in Britain as representing sort of a risk-free rate of interest of 3%. And then you can see that the sort of three countries that during this period would have been regarded, this is sort of in the late 19th and early 20th century, would have been regarded as adhering to the gold standard, Canada, Australia and the United States. They all have interest rates that are, a relatively small margin above that risk-free rate. Whereas if you look at Italy, Argentina, Brazil and Chile, countries that had at various times, for example, had to default on international debts, who wouldn't have been regarded as adhering so strongly to the gold standard, you can see that they were having to pay higher rates of interest on borrowing than the countries which had adhered to the gold standard. So Bordeaux and Rockoff, who did this analysis, call this sort of a good housekeeping seal of approval, that if you were adhering to the gold standard, you were seen as being a responsible country in terms of economic management, and the good housekeeping seal of approval was that you could pay a lower interest rate on your borrowing. Now, the gold standard can be seen as sort of part of a more general way of characterising international economic policy making for countries. And then this more general framework is something called the trilemma. The trilemma says that a country's macroeconomic policy regime can include at most two elements of what's called the inconsistent trinity of three policy goals. First, full freedom of cross-border capital movements. Secondly, a fixed exchange rate. And thirdly, an independent monetary policy. So that is monetary policy where the domestic interest rate differs from international rates. So you're basically adopting sort of a macroeconomic policy that isn't going to be undone by international influences. Now, the relevance of the gold standard to this trilemma is that the gold standard was an arrangement that imposed fixed exchange rates. So if we go back to the trilemma, we can see that basically the trilemma says you can only have 2 out of these 3 things. And the gold standard was basically saying you were going to have this. So that meant that you could only have one of the other 2 things. You could only have either unrestricted flows of international capital, or you could use monetary policy in pursuit of managing your domestic economy, but you couldn't have both. So if you've got the gold standard and you want to have unrestricted flows of international capital, then you have to accept that you cannot have an independent monetary policy or fiscal policy to affect economic activity in your country. If you want to do that, then the only way you can do it is by putting restrictions on capital flows. Now, this trilemma actually maps out quite nicely the evolution of international monetary arrangements and economic policy making in the 19th and 20th century. So basically, in the late 19th and early 20th century, the system that countries adopted was to have the gold standard and to have free international flows of capital, which meant that they accepted that they weren't going to be able to run an independent macroeconomic policy to try and manage macroeconomic activity in their country. Whereas after World War II, there was again arrangements which effectively meant that there were fixed exchange rates, but in that period, countries chose to impose restrictions on international capital mobility so that they could run independent macroeconomic management directed at outcomes in their countries. After the mid to late 1970s, what happens is that countries increasingly move off fixed exchange rates onto flexible exchange rates. And so in the period since the 1970s, we have been able to have the other 2 parts of the trilemma: free international capital flows and countries seeking to independently manage their macroeconomic policy. Now, that first phase of the gold standard, period from around about 1870 through to World War I, finishes first of all because of the disruption of World War I and the Great Depression, which disrupts international trade relations. But also, it was increasingly seen to be a major cost of the gold standard that prevented countries from running independent macroeconomic policies. And the cost, for example, of not being able to run independent macroeconomic policy was that if you developed a balance of payments deficit, it meant that you had to respond to that by deflating your economy, by reducing economic activity. That would often impose hardship through, for example, rising unemployment. And with the increasing political power of the working class, it became less tenable for governments to maintain the gold standard by imposing that type of cost on working class population of deflating and creating unemployment. So as the political power of the working class increased in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, governments came under increasing pressure to adjust their policy settings under the trilemma. That if they were going to maintain fixed exchange rates, then they'd have to restrict capital flows so that they could adopt independent macroeconomic policy management. In the next part of this lecture, I'm going to move on to talk about the rise of the US economy.